Thank you, dear. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate this opportunity very much. And those of you that are not in education need to know when you have a superintendent take time from their busy schedule to come and say good morning and hello, it really speaks very highly and very well for the superintendent, Dr. McCoy, and Dr. Morris as well. Superintendents rarely attend these kinds of meetings. Usually the assistant super or somebody will come. For them to take the time is really, I think, a compliment to all of you of how much they think of you and the activities you're going to go through and the organization. Personally, I want to thank you for this opportunity. I want to thank Tiffany and Patty for inviting me and allowing me. For me, it's a pleasure and an honor and a privilege to be here. On the other hand, when you're 90 years old, it's pretty much a pleasure or an honor to be anywhere. So I'm very grateful to be here in more ways than one. I'm going to be speaking, and one of the things for those of you that drink coffee, keep drinking it. It really does help your health and makes you alert and a lot wiser than you think you are. Coffee's great. I'm going to be sharing some ideas with you. I remember the words of Thomas Paine, who said, if when you are speaking, you're afraid you're going to offend, you'll never tell the truth. And so I hope not to offend you because I'm going to tell the truth. And the truth that I'm going to tell you is based on experience and education in anthropology. I'll be dwelling in the past, which reminds me again of that old Aztec saying. Well, actually, it's not an old Aztec saying, but then there aren't too many old Aztecs around to contradict me. So the old Aztec saying that says, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. What people often forget is the introduction to that conclusion, and that is progress, far from consisting of change, depends upon retention. What is it you're going to retain? Because if you don't remember the past, you're condemned to repeat it. So I'm going to share with you the past. And it's going to be the 1930s, and it's going to focus on the Mexican. But I want you to know that it applies to all groups, and it applies to each of you as we talk about culture. And then I'll jump from that into some definitions and axioms. And then I'll go into a little autobiography. It'll be relevant. Not fascinating, but relevant. And then from there into a little anthropology. And then, if time allows, and it usually doesn't, but if it does, I'll come to the conclusion and wrap it all together for you. What does culture, leadership, education have to do with each other? How are they related? And let's begin with definitions and axioms. And the first of the definition, the obvious one, is culture. There are many definitions, obviously. But we'll use mine since I'm here and you're there, you have no choice. So, culture can be defined as rules, and I'll stop right there for just a moment. Rules. Culture has nothing to do with the color of your skin. That's biological. The definition continues. Rules which, when acted upon, produces a behavior that falls within a range the group finds acceptable. So I was born a Mexican. There are rules for being a Mexican. In order for me to be accepted, I have to know those rules. Now, before we go any further, let me jump to society. Society can be defined as a temporary location occupied by people who share common cultural traditions. Therefore, by that definition, this group here is a society. First, you're temporary. Once the end of this session comes and you're gone, you no longer exist as a group. And secondly, if not more importantly, you share common cultural traditions, not the least of which is, look at the way you're sitting. You're sitting in a chair, all of you almost identical. Not one of you came in and said, boy, I'm pooped, took the chair, took off your shoes, and put your feet on top and said, oh, that feels good. You can do it, but you didn't. And if you look around the room, you won't find anyone wearing their pajamas. They got up this morning and got dressed. No one is wearing a tuxedo. No one is wearing a bathing suit. Yet you could do it, but you don't. It doesn't even come into your mind. Why? Culture. The rule of behavior is you're going to dress exactly the way everybody else is. And as much as you'd like to believe you're unique in your attire, let me tell you, you all look alike. But we do. We get up and say, ah, this looks great. And you walk in and you're the same as everybody else. But that's what makes a society, and that's what makes culture. We forget it exists. And in the conclusion, I'll talk about leaders who ignore culture. Totally. Just accept it. Don't become aware of it. Don't think in terms of culture. So I've given you two definitions. A couple of axioms. I said, share common cultural traditions. And in my definition of culture, I said rules which, when acted upon, produce the behavior the group finds acceptable. Axiom, John English, the philosopher, once wrote, the highest form of human motivation, what gets all of you up every morning to go to work, what motivates you, what moves you, the highest form of human motivation is social acceptance. To be accepted socially, to be respected, to be appreciated. That's true of students who come to school and are not accepted socially, won't succeed. My generation, the 1930s and the 1940s in the Colonia, we were not accepted. And we'll talk about that when we get into the autobiographical. But social acceptance is so important. If you're any kind of a leader, you want to make sure that your employees, your staff, are all accepting each other socially. I tell teachers when I have the opportunity to speak to them, the first thing you should do in your classroom is accept your students socially. Accept them. Check yourself. Have you got low expectations? Have you got some sort of discrimination in you about behavior that you don't like? Before you get into your subject matter, and do your students accept each other? Social acceptance. That's the axiom, the highest form of human motivation. The second one, and the last one, is years and years ago, I always preface my remark with that. You'll do that the same when you become senior citizens. Years and years ago. Because really, you can't talk about the future because, quite frankly, you don't have much of a future when you're in your 90s. You go to bed and you say, God, I hope I wake up tomorrow. And when you wake up, it's a great day. There's nothing better than waking up in the morning. So you all take it for granted. You're planning your summers. You're planning to go on a cruise. When you're 90, you don't do that. You plan for tomorrow, maybe. You really plan for today, that's it. You see the world. Stephen Covey wrote that book on 7 Habits of Others. And years ago, I was invited to be on a panel with him. It was such an honor for me to meet him and chat with him. He wrote in his book, in the 7 Habits, he wrote, you see the world not as it is. You see the world as you are. So keep that in mind as I go through the autobiography and into the little bit of history and then into anthropology. You're going to see what I'm presenting the way you are, not the way your neighbor is or your friend across the way here, but the way you are. It behooves you then, as a leader, you better know who you are. Too often, and I've spoken to superintendents at their Axum things, and one of the things I tell them is be careful. Always remember, there's two of you. One is the title you carry. People make appointments to come and see me. People ask for my advice. People ask for my suggestions. Why? Is it because of the title, or is it because of who you are? Sometimes they're not the same. You play the role of superintendent and believe everybody loves me. Look at, they come, they make appointments to see me because of your title, not because of who you are. So watch yourself. Don't forget who you are before you start pretending what the title says you are. There's a difference. And sometimes we forget. And there's where you lose your integrity, your character, your honesty, your morality, your ethics, because you get it so involved in this title. I'm captain, I'm chief, I'm president. And you forget, I'm Joe. I come from the colonia. My parents were farm workers. You gotta keep that in mind. We lose our humility sometimes. Okay, now let's go to work. I've done my introduction. Let me do my disclaimer. One of the things about being old, you will learn. Oh, my friend Lupe said, aren't you tired of hearing me? 25 years she's been coming to hear me. By now you'd think she'd learn, but okay. Where was I? Oh, when you get, senility creeps in. Sometimes not, not really strong, not dementia or anything, but little things. You forget, what time is it? What day is it? Where am I going? You get in the car and you're in a hurry and you say, wait a minute, where am I going? Why am I going there? Those things happen. It happens to me at home a lot, and it happens when I do presentations. My next line was going to be something really humorous. It was really good. I forgot. So, one of the things I do, because it will happen, I'll forget my next point, and rather than stand here and look at the ceiling trying to remember what was it I was going to say, I will share an anecdote. I will share a story. I ask you, please, don't look for relevancy. Don't ask yourself, well, what has that got to do with what he's talking about? Nothing. It's just that I forgot the next point, and rather than stand here looking up, I'll share a story. Now, I do have to ask, with all due respect, my stories are bilingual. How many of you are bilingual? Thank you. They're in Japanese, and I want to make sure I don't lose you. Aha, see? You laugh because you see the world as you are. You saw me and you said, look at Mendoza, he's a Mexican, look at his complexion, he's going to say Spanish. It never occurred to you I was going to say Japanese. That's why it was funny. But the point is, you see the world, not as it is, but as you are. Okay, come with me, 1930, La Colonia in Oxnard. Now, the thing, first of all, the name of La Colonia comes from a land grant, a little history, comes from a land grant, 1837. 5 or 8 military officers retired, and the tradition in those days was for the government to give them land. They had so much of it they could care less, especially from Mexico to California. So they gave them 40,000, give or take, acres of land, which was along the Santa Clara River, the coast, and then over through the foothills of Camarillo, and then the 101 freeway, if you'll think of that as another one. So that's about 40, give or take, 40,000 acres of land. But the name of the land grant was El Rio Santa Clara o La Colonia. And there's where La Colonia comes from. Real quick, around 1865, they sold it to some businessmen from back east who wanted to look for oil, and they called the oil company La Colonia Oil Company. No big deal. They didn't find any oil, so they sold it to some land developers who called their company La Colonia Garden Land Development Company. Now, the reason these people wanted the land development, La Colonia Gardens, which they dropped later and just called it La Colonia Land Development, was because they were going to build houses for laborers who were going to come from Mexico, China, and Japan. So there were Japanese, Mexicans, and Chinese that moved into these houses because there were 4 brothers. Henry T., the major one, built a sugar factory. And Henry T. needed, obviously, farm workers. Now, the reason he built it in Oxnard was because Maldhart and Borchard and Pettit, farmers still here today, their families, offered to grow sugar beets. And they offered 18,000 acres of land to build it, to grow the thing. So he said, oh, well, then I'll build a sugar factory. The last name of the 3 brothers, Henry T., was Oxnard. And there's where Oxnard gets its name, from Henry T. Oxnard. Originally, by the way, he didn't want to name it Oxnard. He didn't want to name it after himself. He wanted to call it azúcar, Spanish for sugar. But the politicians in Sacramento said, no, 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 azúcar doesn't make sense, Oxnard. So they named it Oxnard. That was in 1898. Now, at the same time, they were able to, I don't know how, bribe, whatever, but ask Santa Fe Railroad to build their railroad instead of straight from Ventura to Camarillo, to do a spur, and they built a turn around and came through Oxnard. Railroad station in 1898 was located on the corner of Mita Street and 5th Street. And as you know, all the streets in Oxnard were north and south, or east and west were numbered, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and north and south they were in alphabet, A, B, C, except for Oxnard Boulevard. Now the railroad station on 5th and Mita obviously then became 5th Street, the center of town, if you will. So they would go from 5th, cross Oxnard Boulevard, A, B, and C. Between B and C, they built the Plaza Park to bring in more tourists. And then they built a hotel on the corner of C and 5th, and a movie theater right across the street called the Strand. Now let's get to La Colonia. Unintended consequence. The railroad became the wall, if you will, between the Mexicans and what we, my generation, called the Americans. Now, there was no Latino, Hispanic, that comes way later. We were all Mexicans. We looked like Mexicans, we acted like Mexicans, we spoke like Mexicans. The culture was Mexican. This side of the railroad track, the east side of the railroad track. On the west side were the Americans. Now, the beauty of the 1930s, growing up, was we had no school. So we didn't have to go to school. However, we did have to go to work. So our parents, and all in the neighborhood, maybe 400 families, was very small, was really a company development owned by the lemon company that came in 1901. They became the Sunkist Lemon Company, and they built a plant there that's still there. And in fact, it was called Seaboard Lemon Packing. And the street was named Seaboard. And the houses built by the company, we rented. At the end of the week, you paid them. The grocery store, owned by the Olmo brothers, was down the corner. They gave us credit as well. And you would, at the end of the week, when you got your paycheck, pay the company for the rent and pay the company for the groceries. There were no cars, so we didn't have to worry about that. Some of them had horses, but no big deal. We walked all the time. Now, We picked, when you reached 9 or 10 years of age, if you were a boy, you went out and picked. We picked apricots out in the Simi Valley in the summer, July, August. Come August, September, you picked walnuts outside of Moore Park. And that was our lifestyle. You worked, you slept, you ate, and you went to church. But that was it. Growing up then, we had no dreams, no visions, no future. If you know anything about the Mexican culture, you know that they live in the present of necessity. God will take care of the future. We worry about the present. Since we had no school, we had even less visions of the future. We raised chickens, rabbits, and we played out in the streets, of course. Until you reach 8, 9, 10, then you go. And the girls the same. When they were 10, they'd go pack lemons. The dream of our parents was that my sisters would pack lemons with my aunts and my mother. The boys would pick lemons or sugar beets or tomatoes or whatever with my father. That was our dream. That was our vision of life, our perception. Until about 1940, 41, they built a school, Ramona School. Ramona School was just beyond McKinley, and that was the end. From McKinley on, there was nothing but orchards. So Ramona was out in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a field. But the interesting thing about Ramona School, first, it was Mexicans only. Secondly, we could not speak Spanish. Every teacher carried a paddle, about a half-inch, quarter-inch. And if they heard you speak Spanish, say a word, a comment, whatever, they would call you over, ask you to bend over, and then they would hit you. There was no worry about capital punishment. And they never discriminated. Teachers would paddle with fervor whether you were a boy or a girl, nor the grade, 1st through 6th. There was no kindergarten. So in the classrooms, we were quiet. You could hear a pin drop. Because we couldn't speak Spanish and we didn't know anything about English, what else are you going to do? And they gave us crayons to color, and they would grade us. If we stayed within the lines, we were okay. You went beyond the lines, you weren't very bright. That was our education. Until you finished 6th grade. You were promoted from 6th to 7th. But 7th and 8th was at a junior high on the other side of the railroad track. For many of us, it was the first time we had ever crossed the railroad tracks. It was located on Palm Drive. And it was the 7th and 8th grade. It was named after a president, Wilson, Woodrow Wilson. In fact, speaking of names, in the 1940s at Ramona School, they changed our names. They wanted to Americanize us. So, for example, I don't know if you know this, but in classrooms, all the smart kids sit up front close to the teacher. I don't know if you knew that. All the discipline problems are in the back. All the good-looking ones are in the middle. Make you feel good. So I was sitting up front, of course. Now, you guys are easy, I tell you. Teacher came to me and said, Jose, obviously she was not bilingual. Jose, from now on, your name is Joseph. I said, wow, where till I get home and tell my mother? Mommy, here's Joseph. Said, Joseph, que nada, hijo de tu padre. So anyway, across was my cousin. We were all related. My cousin, Maria. Teacher came up to Maria and said, Maria, from now on, your name is Mary. So there we were, Joseph and Mary. Until one day Jesus came. Oh, every morning she would take attendance. Joseph, Mary, Jesus, and we would cross ourselves. From there, we went, the boys and girls, you're through at sixth grade, you're around, give or take, 12, 13 years old. Very few of us went on to junior high. You'd go to work. In fact, in Mexico today, they have a certificate, a sixth grade certificate, certificado sexto. And that's about as far as most students go. Once you get that sixth grade certificate, you can go to work. You don't need a work permit, but you're eligible to go to work. And that's what we did in the Colonia. Sixth grade, go pick lemons or go pack them. A few of us went to junior high. Woodrow Wilson Junior High. In fact, for years, all the schools on the American side were named after presidents. There was Wilson, Roosevelt, Lincoln, so forth. For years, we thought Ramona was the president, named after school. The thing about Woodrow Wilson was that it had in the center an office and then wings of classrooms on either side. One wing was for Americans only. They studied reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and penmanship, and so forth. The other wing were for Mexicans only. We studied coloring, finger painting, singing, dancing, woodshop, because we weren't going to go any further, so why would they want to educate us? The playground had a white line painted across it. One side was for Mexicans only, the other side was for Americans only. You couldn't cross that white line. Wasn't bad, except for the fact that on the American side were all the bathrooms. But that didn't bother us either, because on the Mexican side were all the trees. We had a boy tree, girl tree, a third tree just in case. So that was segregation. Now, the other thing, before we go into anthropology, the other thing I want you to, I hope, remember, in the 1930s, 1940s, a little bit of the 50s, but mostly 30s and 40s, when I was growing up, it was against the law to go downtown Oxnard after dark. And we went only during the daytime. And the stores were all located on 5th Street. The hardware stores, the clothing stores, and so forth. And we could go in, but they would never serve us. So we did what we called window shop. We would go look at the windows. The Plaza Park, Sundays after church, after Mass, the boys would walk in one direction, the girls in the opposite direction. The girls were always chaperoned. And as you walked, you would look at them, and if you could make eye contact, that's a good sign. If they weren't interested in you, they wouldn't look at you. But come dusk, once the sun starts to set, you better be back in La Colonia. They would put you in jail overnight. Next morning, they would drive you over there and then dump you off in the Colonia. The Zoot Zooters of the 40s, and we had many in La Colonia, if they were caught there overnight and spent the night in jail, when they were brought back by the police, they would tear their trousers, who were cuffed, if you remember your Zoot Zooters, and you probably don't, and they were torn. And their ducktails and back were sheared off. So they were, in that sense, punished physically, because their clothes were torn apart. And the coats were long with a chain, and they would tear them to embarrass them. When there was a fire in La Colonia, the trains would be stopped on the tracks. There was no fire engine. The fire engine was on the American side. So if a house started burning, we had to help put it out, and we usually couldn't. It would burn to the ground. Ambulances would be the same. There would be trains, and the ambulance couldn't cross. Patient might not survive. The theater, the Strand Theater, there were 2 entrances. Front entrance for Americans, back entrance through the alley, up the stairs to the balcony for Mexicans. So the theater had balcony for Mexicans only. The ground floor was for Americans only. Now the question that I hope you're asking yourself is, how could you tolerate that? How could you stand that? Why didn't you stand up and march? Why didn't you go to the board? Board minutes, even today, board minutes. My friend Frank Baracus wrote a book on it, and he went and looked, and it said very clearly, the board members, we don't want the Mexicans to come to our schools, they'll contaminate. All Mexicans are mentally retarded anyway. Keep them in Ramona, that's their school. Why did we accept it? Why didn't we stand up and march? Why didn't we stand up and fight? Why didn't we stand up and do something? Because we were Mexicans. Now, before I come to any more conclusions, I now will move into anthropology. I'll come back to that issue, into anthropology. Hopefully to clarify. For this, I'll need 4 volunteers. Would you 4 mind standing over here, please? That'll teach you to sit up front. They're the smart ones. Okay, that's it. You can get close. They don't have cooties. Okay. All right. In anthropology, there's a law. It's called Moore's Law. Okay? Would you mind walking and standing right over here, please? Dr. Morris did years and years of research, and he concluded the following. Now, we could disagree, but let's not for the sake of time. Okay. Dr. Morris' Law says, this young man, and we're using our imagination here, so don't get offended with me. This young man is a Mexican. He comes from Morelia, Michoacan, Mexico. And he comes to this country, to La Colonia in Oxnard, and he moves in there. And he lives there. Dr. Morris declares he is first generation. Again, we could argue, but let's accept that at face value. In his study, Dr. Morris concludes that first generation retains the culture. Keep that in mind. And by the way, this applies to all of you. Some of you here are first generation. Some of you will talk about you second, third, and fourth in a little bit, but hold on. First generation retains, that is to say, he's a Mexican from Morelia, he lives in Oxnard, he's still a Mexican from Morelia. He does not become an American. He's a Mexican. I'm often asked, especially by teachers, who cares? And the answer is, if you know a person's culture, you can predict their behavior. If you study him, his first generation, what does a first generation value more than life itself? More than his own life? He values the family. The family. Okay, so I'm going to call a meeting of parents. And he doesn't come. Why not? Because he can't bring his family. But invite him and tell him to bring his family, his children, his grandchildren, his grandparents, the family. They'll come. Why? Culture. Among Mexicans, number one, the family. Which, by the way, with all due respect, that's not true of the American. The American Generation Z today, family isn't number one. You got to be kidding. Where's your daughter? I don't know, she went out. Ask a Mexican, where's your daughter? She's in her room. No, over there, over here. Homework, no, she's in her room. The values of the first generation: family, religion, but a fatalistic religion. Well, your son can't read, having trouble reading, not a good reader. His response: that's God's will. God wanted me to have someone that could read. Well, God would have given me one. They accept that. The first generation sends its kids to school so you can teach them. So you send homework and say, help him with the homework. He's going to say, wait a minute. I'm not sending you my dirty dishes. Why are you sending me your schoolwork? Doesn't understand. The first generation Mexican doesn't understand this idea of you're part of his education, you're part of school, go to meetings, PTA, whatever. No, that's your job. Does the doctor call me in when he's operating and say, help me provide surgery here? Does the auto mechanic call me and say, hey, help me repair the car? No, that's your job. You do it. But tell this first generation Mexican who retains the culture, your son is misbehaving. Uh-oh. That's a reflection of him. And what he's going to do, you should know, because you've got to know the culture. Send him home. I promise you, tomorrow he'll be an angel. Why? Because he's going to beat the tar out of him. He's going to beat him. He's not going to reason with him. He's not going to sit him down and say, now, you know, son, you really need to behave. No, he's going to pick him up, throw him up against the wall, and then go beat the tar out of him. That's what fathers do. That's their job. Mothers, first generation, will talk him to death. You're going to die if you keep misbehaving. You want the devil to take over? That's why you're misbehaving. The devil's coming after you. God's going to punish you. Oh, they'll nag you and nag you and nag you. That's what first generation mothers do. If you know the culture then, and you're a teacher, you're going to say, I'm going to tell your mother. But you want to frighten this kid to death, say, I'm going to tell your father. That'll scare him. Okay, would you come and stand right here? Perfect. Good job. He gets married and has a son. You're his son. Say hi to your father. This is the son.
Better be good. I got my belt.
Morris says this is second generation. And Morris concludes second generation resists the culture. Uh-oh. Why is he resisting? Don't forget, they're in the colonia. He's resisting because he goes to school. And in school, one of the purposes, if not the main purpose of schools and education, is to acculturate, is to give them a new culture, new rules of behavior. So the first thing he's learning is run, spot, run, English. And he comes to father, and he says, Father, run, spot, run. And father says, no, aquí no me vengas que corre el perro, a mí no me importa. Aquí se habla español. Esa es tu casa, español. So he's got to speak Spanish when he comes home. He comes to school, and he says to the teacher, I didn't learn, why not? Well, I can't speak English at home. This is a confused kid. That's why he's resisting. Am I a Mexican or am I an American? Which one am I? And they try to be what they call popularly bicultural. How can you be bicultural? Two rules of behavior. That's what bi means. So he's going to have two rules of behavior and make it into one? That's what they're expecting. That's hard to do. For those of you who are not bilingual, let me give you an illustration. That monolingual people find difficult concept to embrace, to vision. It's very simple. Voy a comenzar a hablar en español y voy a tomar este tema y desarrollarlo right away into English and speak the very same topic that I'm speaking over there in Spanish, I'm going to do in English, pero luego voy a cambiar y voy a hablar en español sobre el mismo tema, no importa, ¿verdad? But it doesn't make any difference. And people say, wow, he's going from one language to the other. I get a headache. That's hard, because what you don't understand is when I'm speaking in Spanish, you as a group have a personality that I perceive totally different than when I'm speaking in English. English is not my native language yet. I speak it relatively fluently. But you change. In English, you're Americans. En español, ustedes son mexicanos. Totalmente diferente than this group over here. That's what makes bicultural an impossibility. How can I be both? I've got to be one or the other to be true to myself. Who am I? Am I both? I submit, no. You have to choose. You're Mexican who can speak English. And you know how Americans behave, but you're a Mexican. Fatalistic. Family first. That's what makes second generation difficult. It was second generation, by the way, that went to war in the Second World War in the 40s. And this generation that resisted came back as Americans, GIs. In fact, as a group, Mexicans earned more medals of valor than any other group in the Second World War. He comes back. But does he come back to be with father in la colonia? No, the GI Bill says you can buy a house. So he didn't have to come to la colonia. He could go to the other side, on the American side. And there's where the population of Oxnard blew in the 40s, after the Second World War, 45. Not only that, he gets married. And does he marry Guadalupe Maria? No, he marries Betty and Mary. Blonde, blue eyes. Doesn't speak a word of Spanish, and he comes. Worse, they're Protestants. Even worse, the Republicans. Well, no, let's not go there. That's your second generation. Resists.
I knew it was me.
You don't want to marry him? Is that what you're saying? Okay. He gets married and has a beautiful daughter, as you can see. Say hi to your father. And there's your grandfather. That's your grandfather over there. Okay. Morris says third generation. And here's the fascinating part about the study by Morris. Third generation, you would assume by now, acculturate. They're Americans. No. Third generation, Morris declares, discovers, rediscovers the first generation. She wants to go visit Grandpa and have those white round things, tortillas. For those of you that are not bilingual, tortillas. She's tired of Wonder Bread with peanut butter and jelly. And she wants to hear the music, and she wants to hear the stories. And Grandpa will tell him. And they all say the same thing. I rode with Pancho Villa. There's not a grandfather that won't say, I rode with Pancho Villa. Rediscovers is your third generation. In high schools today, a lot of third generations. A lot. Rediscover. Rediscover. And the thing about this rediscovery is this third generation are the ones that are starting to think now of going to college, graduating from high school. Third generation. Second, a little bit, you have more difficulty with the second, but not the third. Become bilingual now. But interesting, third generation in 1970-71 in Los Angeles at Roosevelt High School went on a strike and began the Chicano movement. It was the third generation. Third generation went to second and said, Viva Zapata. Second generation said, Viva who? Went to first generation, Viva Zapata. Oh, yeah, I used to ride with him. Rediscovers. If you wouldn't mind. She gets married, and she has a handsome young man, as you can see. Say hi to your mother, your grandfather, and your great-grandfather. When I share this activity with migrant parents, I have literally had them cry. Tears when I say to them, You first generations that are sitting here right now, in 4 generations, this one isn't going to remember you. Won't know anything about you. You won't exist. Won't speak the language anymore. Loses the language. And loses the tradition. Loses the culture. This generation acculturates. And I tell the parents who are first generation, if you don't want that to happen, take them into the kitchen, this one, and share the stories of your family. You take your family into the kitchen, tell them the stories of your family. And you do the same for this one. Because if you don't, and it usually stops about here, third a little bit, third rarely, you won't exist. You will not have existed. Okay, you can sit down. A round of applause for our volunteers, please. Okay. I've now come to the conclusion. I'm going to end early, by the way, which should be good because then you can stay. Because there's so much more I want to share, but I have to kind of curb it and stay within time limits. Let's try to bring it all together: education, culture, and leadership. I mentioned to you about leaders getting hung up on their titles and the culture. Let me start first with one of the problems with education. Now, allow me again, because I said to you, you see the world as you are. I'm old. I've already declared that openly. And because I'm old, I have experiences that you are going to have, and I want to kind of prepare you for them, because you're going to have them, trust me. The aches and pains are going to come. The body just poops out. It does. Suddenly your hearing is gone or losing. Your memory isn't quite as good. Your patience, not as strong as it used to be. But the spirit, that's different. The spirit can stay young. That's your salvation. The spirit. And the spirit comes from you. You have to believe in yourself. So, a leader, the problem with schools today, there are 7 groups. First, you have your board of trustees. They have a culture. Then you have your administrators, your superintendents, your assistant superintendents, the administrators. Then you have your certificated staff, your teachers, your resource teachers, all credentialed. Then you have your classified, your secretaries, your bus drivers, your cafeteria workers, your paraeducators. Then you have your students. And then you have your parents. And the group that hardly anyone ever thinks about, let alone cares about, but still should be included and never is, or hardly ever, there's a group, the community. Your organizations, your Lions Club, Kiwanis, your Rotarians, the Red Cross, your firefighters, your police, your private industries, Amgen, your writers, Driscoll's. They're all big corporations, businesses, are never part of the groups of education, this group. Now, the problem with education is that there is no commonality. They should all be, these areas, they should all have areas of commonality. I have often heard people say, the strength of this country is its diversity. I take exception. I submit to you, the strength of this country is commonality. What we all have in common is what makes us strong. We should recognize diversity, but we should celebrate commonality. How many months are dedicated to American? Being an American. Being an American. We're part of an idea. That's the frailty of this country. The idea that we are all equal. Let me tell you, people, it's still not accepted today. We're all equal. We're all Americans. The biggest mistake government made was in their census when they started hyphenating. Irish American, German American, Mexican American, instead of American, of Mexican descent, but American. Our emphasis should be on commonality. That's our strength. And that's the problem with school. What's the purpose of school? You can ask the board, and the board will say, well, as long as they follow the rules, we're going to be okay. You can ask the administrators. Administrators make decisions, first based on the legality. Is this legal? Secondly, do I have the money? Is it in the budget? Third, will the people support it? Fourth, last, is it good for kids? The teacher is the exact opposite. The teacher says, is this good for kids? Yeah, okay, let's do it. What happened to legality, and what happened to budget, and what happened to they could care less. This is good for the kids. Let's take them to Disneyland. Let's go. It's up to the administrator. You can't take them to Disneyland because the law says and the rules are, and it's not educated, and so forth. Why did they think of that? Because there's no commonality. You've got to, the superintendent is the leader, should be the visionary, should be ensuring that everybody, without exception, everybody has a common purpose, a common mission. The superintendent should not be administering. Superintendent shouldn't be running the school districts. That's the assistant soups. Superintendent should bring everybody together and say, okay, is everybody okay? Is there anything that's not going right, wrong? What do you see? Because I want our students to learn how to read and write. I don't care about anything else. Read and write. Now everybody, assuming, buys into that. You're going to have kids reading and writing before you know it. Because they're focused, their attention. And by the way, the students don't know why they go to school. My generation didn't. In fact, we didn't have school, but when we did, we went why? Because my mother told me to go. The teachers didn't care. Teachers gave us crayons. So they didn't care about us. That's the difference between my generation of education and the generation today. Look at yourselves and all the organizations that are here. How much overlap is there among all your organizations? Oh, well, I can't see. I deal with ambulances and you deal with fire engines. What are we going to get? Come together, you'd be surprised, the commonality that you have and the strength that you'll develop. We have to understand that each of these groups has to have commonality with the other. The principal has to have something in common with the students, not delegated to the teachers to work with the students. That's not my job. That's a teacher's job. That's the weakness. And that's the weakness to any organization. I don't care who you are. Look at your organ. What's the culture of your organization? What is it that drives them? Because it has to be what you, the leader, want. That's the challenge of culture, leadership, and education. is to create commonality of purpose, of mission, of behavior. I was, years ago, on a panel with a superintendent of Ventura Unified, Dr. Pat Rooney. He invited me. I was president of the Teachers Association. And so I sat in the panel with him, and we were talking to brand new teachers, new to the district. And then was a question answer. And one of the teachers stood up and asked Pat, Dr. Rooney, said, when you hire a teacher, what's the one quality you look for? Pat smiled. He looked at me, and he said, well, Joe, what do you think? And I said, I'm no dummy. So you got to be kidding, whatever you say. And Pat said, well, it's not skill. I can train them for that. It's not talent, not dedication, not commitment, no. The biggest quality I look for is loyalty. Loyalty. If they're loyal to the educational program that we have, not to me, to the program, they're loyal to it, then commitment, dedication, courage, creativity comes along with it. But loyalty, I cannot train. I cannot teach loyalty. You have to have it. In order to create loyalty, you have to have commonality. And that's my last point. If you look at any district's budget, you'll find that 90, 95%, sometimes more, but in those areas, are salaries, benefits and salaries. A few percentages for maintenance, and even less percentage for training of teachers, staff development, they call it. Very little. And yet, that's where the preponderance of your money should go, is training. Training teachers, bringing teachers, parents, students, administrators, board members, the classified staff, and the community, bringing them together at least once a month, if not more, and talk about what is it we're trying to accomplish. Are we accomplishing it? If you don't create commonality, you have division. If you have any doubts about the need for common, look at Washington, D.C., for God's sakes. A Republican and a Democrat can't get together. They're so hung up on titles and their point of views. That's what's wrong with education. In retrospect, then, look at your own organization. What is the culture of your organization? What's the motivation? What's the primary mission? And does everybody understand it and support it? If they don't, you better get rid of them. Trust me, it's like a cancer, it'll spread. They'll tell Mary, Mary will tell Sally, Sally will tell Tom, and pretty soon you've got an uprising. And finally, in conclusion, leaders, you really don't know, if you really are a leader, you won't know you are. You really don't say to yourself, I'm a leader. Leader is a behavior, it's a culture. You have a vision and you're able to communicate it, you're able to develop support for it, and you're able to move on. And you're able to compromise. But the quality that I always push for, don't expect anything in return. Don't expect a medal, a trophy, a plaque, an award. Don't expect a thank you. Well, I opened the door, how come I didn't get a thank you? Don't expect it. Leader doesn't expect recognition. But years from now, and I mean many years from now, when you enter those pearly gates, you're going to hear a voice say to you those words that you so richly deserve. Well done, good and faithful servant. Thank you.
Oh. You are just
Amazing. Thank
Good
you so
job.
much.
Go to work. It's your turn.
What a great way to start the day.